Welcome to this web lecture about the selection of and working with users in participatory design. The first question we need to ask is, who are the users that are going to work with us? And this is not as obvious as you think. Users can be those who interact directly with the product. And very often, these are the only users we think of. But there are other people who are considered users. For instance, the managers of the direct users. Managers who have to manage budgets and have to keep their users also, their employees happy. They are concerned, for instance, with the efficiency of the product. Maybe something that is less fun to use actually helps the users to work twice as fast, and that's what the manager is interested in. Then there are users who receive output from a product. Like a word processor is not only used by people entering the text, but the people who have to read the output on paper are essentially also users of the word processor. And a very important set of users is those who make purchasing decisions. Microsoft, for instance, has been very successful in talking with corporations about making the Microsoft software a corporate standard. It doesn't really matter how happy the end users interacting directly with the product are, right? As long as management has not been told and convinced to buy the product, the end users will not get to experience it. There may also be users of competitors' products who you need to persuade to switch to your product. Those are also to be considered users. Obviously, we are mostly concerned in the first type, and the others, we mostly call them stakeholders and not really users. Three categories of users need to be considered. The primary users use the product all the time. Like for a word processor, people who write documents all day long are primary users. Secondary users use a product occasionally, or even only experience it through someone else, like reading the output of a word processor. Tertiary users are affected by a product. They may influence its purchase, right, but they're not directly involved with the product. In some sense, even someone who loses their job because technology is introduced is a tertiary user. Is affected by the introduction of technology. Each of these categories influences system design, but we will obviously focus mostly on primary and a bit on secondary users. Where do we find users that are willing to work with us in participatory design? So we need to get in touch with real potential users. We need to know our customer base, even when it doesn't yet exist. Many projects actually fail because a system was developed that nobody wants or for which nobody has any real use. There are very famous failures. Right? One of the failures that springs to mind is the Philips digital cassette recorder. Some of you may remember that long before we had MP3 players and CD players, we used tape to record audio. And tape initially was done on large reels, and later it was done in small cassette forms. The recordings were made in analog form, and analog music was considered the best. Now, Philips introduced the digital cassette recorder, And the digital cassette recorder had good sound quality, but it used a technology with lossy compression. So yes, some of the detail is lost, but you won't hear that. The problem is that most people were happy with the analog tapes. Only people who wanted the best possible sound were open to buy a more expensive new technology that could be digital. These people you could not convince by telling them, oh yes, we use lossy compression, you lose something but you won't hear it. So in the end, nobody wanted this. And probably you have never seen a digital cassette recorder because it was a failure. Systems must perform a task that is needed by real people, and it needs to be more than just a cool idea. Also, when you think you have a very good idea that is good for you, it may not yet be good for many other people. There are these competitions, and like beste idee van Nederland, the best new invention in the Netherlands. A lot of the ideas that are presented there are a cool idea that may be useful for the inventor, but that is not going to create a large market. And that makes it not the best idea. You need to know that you will have a potential customer base. Now, if you find your real potential users, you need to convince them to work with you. Experience shows that using bribes, t-shirts, mugs, memorabilia, right, works better than just giving them money to work with you. People typically are not in it for the money, but they're in it for the fame. If that also fails, we use students. But we don't use just any students. Like if you want to develop an interface for lawyers, you have to use law students. Otherwise, they will not be representative. Next, we have to consider the user's capabilities. Humans vary in physical and cognitive dimensions. In the physical dimensions, the size of hands, for instance, may affect the size and positioning of input buttons. When we're designing something which includes hardware, we have to consider that the size of the hands, for instance, of a child are different from that of an adult. Motor abilities may be different. A game to complete a puzzle, right, needs to be more lenient towards correct positioning when it's used by toddlers than when it's used by adults, because the small children don't yet have enough motor control. We also need to consider position, especially for physical kiosks or workplaces. The library in Eindhoven at some point installed workstations with horizontal screens where you could navigate through the library catalog. And they installed these horizontal screens next to the windows so that with the glare from the light coming in through the windows, you couldn't read the screen. We have to consider strength. When children are playing with a toy, right, they use very little physical force. The electric toys are designed in such a way that the strength of a child is not sufficient to open the battery compartment to change the batteries. Right? An adult needs to change the batteries, right, so that there is no risk that a child will actually swallow a battery. We also need to consider eyesight. And there is a reason why, for instance, Apple first introduced these very high-resolution retina screens and then set the default of the system to magnify everything. You don't normally use the native resolution of the screen because everything will be very, very, very small. Now, what are the user's needs? Don't just ask the users because they cannot always answer you, especially regarding the interface design. The users don't know what is possible in graphical user interfaces these days, and so they will give you outdated ideas based on their knowledge. So you need to look at, for instance, existing tasks and decide for yourself, like, what information do the users really require? Who is collaborating to achieve a task, if it is collaborative? And why do people work on a task and achieve a task in the way they currently do? So that you then can work on the envisioned new tasks or new ways to execute tasks. So you can look back at existing behavior and try to generalize from it, right? And use that to describe the future scenarios. We need to analyze the problem space. Are there problems with an existing product that you want to replace? If the existing product is just fine, then you may already have discovered a reason why a new product makes no sense. So why do you think there are problems? Why do you think you can do better? And when people have something that works, they need some incentive to replace this perfectly good thing they have by something new. Not everyone just wants the latest iPhone because it exists. For many people, as long as their phone does what they want, they're not going to buy a new one. How can you see people using your new technology in the way they tend to do things? Is it going to support them in their activities? Is it not just a gimmick? Right? Is it really useful for them? Let's look at an example. What you see here is an old-fashioned phone, like the ones that were used when WAP was introduced. You may not remember what WAP is because it quickly ceased to exist. Many years ago, people already thought that WAP, or sort of web-based online applications available on a phone with very limited functionality, would be a good idea. Why would anyone want to use a phone like the one we show on the slide here? Why would you want to use such a crappy phone to do online activities? Is the fact that this becomes possible and allows us to sell a new type of phone, is that a solution looking for a non-existing problem, or is there a real problem it can solve? So we need to check our assumptions and see whether they are reasonable or not. People want to be kept informed of up-to-date news wherever they are. Sounds reasonable to me. And even if you have a very small screen, and if there is a calamity somewhere, if the trains have a delay, a small screen is all you need to tell the users that something is up. Reasonable assumption. People also want to interact with information on the move. Maybe they want to order Chinese or a pizza to be delivered by the time they are about to get home. Could be reasonable. Some people do that. And certainly nowadays, when our devices are more comfortable, we often do that. We already interact with services while we're still on the road. Reasonable assumption. People will be happy using their phone with a very small display, right, and a restricted interface to do online interactions. That is not reasonable. And people will not be happy. They will use these services if they really need them, but it won't be enjoyable. The device is just too restricted. People will be happy doing things on a cell phone with a small screen that they normally would do on a PC. There may be a very small audience that thinks that this is reasonable. Right? for most people, this will not be reasonable. I would rather use the large screen than a screen with a few lines of text. I may be persuaded to use the phone, but I wouldn't say I will be happy doing this. So you have to really consider that. Now, you have been given an assignment to create a mobile room thermostat. So you'll do it, but think about whether the assumptions that people want to be able to control the heating system in their house while they're on the move and only have their phone to interact with. Maybe you'll see that this is reasonable. Maybe you think this is just a gimmick. The reality is that mobile thermostats are coming on the market. So it may not yet be too late for you to enter that market as well, but then your design will have to be really, really good, and we will judge whether it actually is. Thank you for participating.